To illustrate this exchange by some examples, we may find perhaps that something which perception takes to be an animal with strong muscles is defined as an animal organism of high irritability. Or what perception takes to be a condition of great weakness is defined as a condition of high sensibility. Or if we prefer it, as an abnormal affection, and moreover, a raising of it to a higher potency, expressions which translate sensuous facts into Latin, and a bad Latin at that, instead of into the notion. That an animal has strong muscles may also be expressed by the understanding by saying that the animal possesses a great muscular force, great weakness meaning similarly a slight force. Determination in terms of irritability has this advantage over determination in terms of force, that the latter expresses indeterminate, but the former determinate, reflection into self. For the force peculiar to muscle is precisely irritability. And irritability is a preferable determination of strong muscle sense, as in force, reflection into self is already directly implied in it. Similarly, weakness or slight force, organic passivity, is given determinate expression in terms of sensibility. But when this sensibility is so taken by itself and fixed, and in addition is bound up with quantitative determinations, and qua greater or less sensibility is opposed to a greater or less irritability, each is wholly in the element of sense and is reduced to the ordinary form of a property. What connects them is not the notion, but on the contrary, a quantitative antithesis, which becomes a difference lacking any thought content. Though the indefiniteness of the expressions force, strength, and weakness was thereby eliminated, there now arises the equally futile, vague floundering about between the antitheses of higher and lower sensibility and irritability as they increase and decrease relatively to one another. The determinations of greater or lesser sensibility or irritability are no less the unthinking apprehension and expression of a sensuous phenomenon than are the wholly sensuous determinations of strength and weakness, which are devoid of any thought content. Those thoughtless expressions have not been replaced by the notion. Instead, strength and weakness have been given a determination which, taken solely by itself, is based on the notion, which it has for its content. But it loses completely this origin and character. On account of the form of simplicity and immediacy in which this content is made into the aspect of a law, and because quantity constitutes the element of difference in such determinations, the essence of the content, which originally is the notion and is posited as such, retains the mode of sense perception and remains as far removed from being cognized as when determined in terms of strength and weakness or by immediate sense properties. Here in this long paragraph number 282, Hegel is not telling us anything radically new that he hasn't already been explaining at great length in the passages preceding this. He says that he's going to provide us with some examples to try to make this a bit more concrete for us, to allow us to wrap our heads around it, as we say in our parlance. And so in a way, he's sort of taking a pause before the final push through the rest of this section of observing reason, where he's going to turn explicitly in the next paragraph to saying, okay, now we really need to consider the outer, not just the inner. And the examples that he provides here, along with a few asides that we'll look at in a moment, the examples that he provides here are not particularly concrete, but they work for what it is that he's trying to get across. And I've got this sort of schema up here to help you visualize what's going on. So he says, we might find that something which perception takes to be an animal with strong muscles, right? So we're starting out at a sort of base level of perception, which is something that we're doing all the time, right? Observing reason observes the world through sense perception, not just sense perception, because the understanding is also involved, but sense is very important. So the sensuous aspect of the thing. We look at an animal and we say that animal's got strong muscles. You know, and we might think of all sorts of interesting examples based on scale. You know, think of animals that we use as pack animals or for carrying out specific purposes, like the bulldozer of so many places, the elephant. We might think of predatory animals that are able to bring down their prey, like the tiger or the lion. But we might also think about other animals who are incredibly strong in comparison to their size, like, for example, ants, right? Ants can do, and really animals that have exoskeletons and that sort of arrangement, which include, not just insects, but also arthropods, and we can go on and on and on. They can be incredibly strong. Of course, they have different kinds of muscle than these sorts of muscle. But that's a starting point. And we can talk about an animal having strong muscles. We might contrast that to a condition of great weakness, as he talks about. And he says, we might define that as an animal organism of high irritability. And that's what we've been doing, in contrasting the external, the outer, what it is that we're able to observe through our senses, and then the inner. The inner not being something that's inside it physically, but rather inner as in its dynamism, what is going on with it. And as we saw before, you can have a cadaver that has strong muscles. They're no longer actually strong, because there's no ability to use them. But you don't have a dead thing that has a condition of high irritability. It has to be a living organism. So he says, what perception takes us to be a condition of great weakness is defined as a condition of high sensibility, or I've got here sensitivity. We'll just leave it there. Either one is a decent translation. Or if we prefer it, as an abnormal affection, and moreover a raising of it to a higher potency, right? So sensibility or sensitivity is being raised to a higher level. And Hegel makes a little aside here at this point, which is rather telling. And I think it's something that applies well to his own time, but we might also consider how people use this sort of terminology, not Latin terminology, but other terminology in our own time. So he says, these are expressions which translate sensuous facts into Latin. Now, that's an interesting thing to say. They're not translating sensuous facts into the notion, or even into the objects of the understanding per se. He says they translate sensuous facts, what we might call the language of perception, into a language that we use to articulate it, right? So if we think of languages in this respect as not living languages, at that time Latin was used as a scientific language, right? As it still was for quite a while after Hegel. If we think of language as kind of an artificial system for classifying, for operating on things, something that is of the understanding, it's almost like a code, right? But it's not a code used by living beings to, communicate about everything. It's only used for this specific sort of issue or matter. And so when we translate it, as we do in that way, we're translating it into something that makes us feel as if somehow we're getting at the reality of it. But it's really just providing us with another, something external, really. Something that doesn't get at the heart of what it is that we're talking about. This is a problem that has been going on for a long time. People use jargon and substitute jargon for actual thinking about things, and they think through jargon. In business language, you see a lot of that. We're going to drill down. That's a very popular phrase at this time. 5 years from now, that's going to be very outmoded. There's all sorts of trendy things that people say, and you're kind of get a sense of what they're supposed to mean, but they can mean all sorts of different things because there really is no genuine meaning backing it, that you can point to. Nothing that the understanding can really latch onto. It soothes the understanding. It's very much like what Hegel was calling description, much earlier on. Okay, so that aside, he says, we're translating sensuous facts into Latin, and a bad Latin at that, because it's not a Latin that's actually used for anything other than just communicating between savants, rather than the notion. He says that an animal has strong muscles may be expressed by the understanding to say that the animal possesses great muscular force. So we're starting to get a bit more abstract in moving up that chain, right? It's not quite so far as saying irritability. And Hegel says great weakness would then similarly mean a slight force, right? Possesses very little force or has passivity. He says, now force, he says, expresses indeterminate, but talking in terms of sensitivity expresses something more determinate. He says, determination in terms of irritability has an advantage. So up at this level, we have a kind of advantage. What is the advantage? The latter, force, expresses something indeterminate, the former determinate reflection into self. So we've seen Hegel talk about this over and over again. There is this reflection into self that is taking place. These concepts, if we like, or these ways of understanding things, the more that they approximate to the notion, the more living they are, the more dynamic they are. So simply having a condition of great weakness is not, strictly speaking, the same thing as possessing very little force, let alone a condition of high sensibility or high sensitivity. Likewise, we can say the same thing as we move up the scale on this end. As we're doing that, we're moving from sense to the understanding, right? It doesn't mean that we're leaving sensibility behind or perception behind, but it's being integrated into the understanding, which, remember, is ultimately still trying to produce laws for the things that it's observing. So he goes on and he says, when this is taken so by itself and fixed, and in addition is bound up with quantitative determinations and qua greater or less sensibility as opposed to a greater or less irritability, each is wholly in the element of sense and is reduced to the ordinary form of a property. What connects them is not the notion, the sort of living thought, right? But on the contrary, a quantitative antithesis which becomes a difference lacking any thought content. Now this is, Hegel is saying what he's already said many times before. If we're going to try to make sense of these things solely in terms of quantitative determinations, and we might say the, ratios or determinations or, observable connections between these, well, we're going to lose sight of what it is that we're attempting to study. And it's much easier to do this down at this level. It becomes, a bit more difficult here. As we get further up, we start to see that, these connections that we're making are pretty ad hoc. There's nothing necessary about them. And so that's what Hegel means about these quantitative determinations being differences that are not real differences. They're sort of indifferent difference, as he's called it so many times before. Now, it's interesting that he says that when we're doing that, we're essentially dealing with these things in terms of sense, because you might say, well, wait a second, aren't numbers a matter for the understanding? Yes, they are, but they're not a matter for the whole understanding. They're, you might say, a matter for the understanding insofar as the understanding is operating like something that's just involved with perception, right? You could quibble, of course, when we get to the very interesting branches of mathematics, but Hegel is not really attuned to that, some of the developments that are going to take place in mathematics later on. He's thinking in terms of what it is that scientists actually purport, not always do, but purport to do, which is to measure things and to try to come up with, reasoned connections between these things based on the quantifiable data. Now, as we know in our own time, there's all sorts of problems that come up with that, particularly when we're not just dealing with organisms, which are tough enough, but systems of human beings, the social sciences. But that's a whole different thing that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. So he goes on and he says, through the indefiniteness of the expressions force or strength or weakness, though that was eliminated, there now arises the equally futile, vague floundering about between the antitheses of higher and lower sensibility or irritability as they increase or decrease relatively to each other. We saw him trying this out for size and saying, no, that's not going to work, in an earlier paragraph where he talked about these attempts to introduce ratios. And you can certainly do that. There is like an achievement that's possible. You could, write about it, you measure things, put it in a journal, but unfortunately you've lost sight of what it is that you were actually supposed to be measuring, which is the thing, the organic being. And he says the determinations of greater or lesser sensibility or irritability then are no less the unthinking apprehension and expression of a sensuous phenomenon, right? Than are the wholly sensuous determinations of strength and weakness, which are devoid of any thought content. So the trouble is if we're going to read this sort of thing into here, or into here, we're going to end up lowering these to the level of just sense and sense perception. Now, why would we do that? Well, jumping ahead a little bit, what is reason aiming at this entire time? Laws. And it thinks that laws have to be framed in that sort of manner, and if it can't do that, then it has to bring the materials down to the level of the sensuous so that it can do that. In the process, it's going to lose grasp on the notion. Hegel says that the notion is still grounding everything, but it's being misunderstood in the process. So he says, those thoughtless expressions have not been replaced by the notion. That's the goal, right? To replace them by the notion. Instead, strength and weakness have been given a determination which, taken solely by itself, is based on the notion, which it has for its content, right? But it's lost the form of the notion. That's a problem, right? What does it mean to lose the form of the notion? In part, because this is a sort of thing that we have to unpack at length, I would say, in part it means losing sight of what it was that you were actually engaged in and your own role as consciousness in participating in it, because that's implicit in the Hegelian, notion, the Begriff, the concept. So he goes on and he says, on account of the form of simplicity and immediacy in which this content is made into the aspect of a law, and because quantity constitutes the element of difference, the existence of the content, which originally is the notion and is posited as such, that's what we started with, trying to make sense of the notion, retains the mode of sense perception and remains as far removed from being cognized as when determined in terms of strength and weakness by immediate sense properties. So long as we are attempting to deal with the organic being and its properties or its functions, like irritability, sensibility, reproduction, in terms of what's going on down here, which is more manageable, we're losing sight of it, and we're really engaging in what Hegel would be willing to call unscientific science. Things can postulate themselves as being scientific because they use the apparatus of science or because they make some vague appeal to scientific method, right? But to really be scientific, to be, wissenschaftliche, means to grasp how things connect with each other and to grasp the adequacy of what it is that one is up to. In this case, we're talking about observation of nature, and specifically observation of that part of nature that turned out to be quite intractable, namely organic nature. Now, there still remains to be considered solely on its own account what the outer aspect of organic being is and how in it the antithesis of its inner and outer is determined, just as at first the inner of the whole in relation to its own outer was considered. On heels of a very long paragraph, we now have this very short paragraph, number 283, in which Hegel is pivoting us, so to speak. So we just had a paragraph where he was reminding us of all sorts of interesting things, but not really contributing anything new. And now in this very short condensed paragraph, he's going to open up a new door. And this may be something that you've been wondering about as we've gone through the previous paragraphs. He starts out by saying that there's still something that needs to be considered on its own. And I don't want to give the impression that there's only one thing that still needs to be considered on its own, because there are many, 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 many things coming up. We're only about a third of the way into the work, so there's a lot of other stuff yet to go. But at least with respect to the organic substance, the organic being, the organism, he says there's still something that needs to be considered on its own account, für sich allein, for itself, apart from other things. We've dealt with it, we've touched upon it, but we haven't quite gotten into that yet. So he's promising us what we're going to be engaging with in the paragraphs yet to come. Now, you remember we talked about in the past the inner having both an inner of the inner and an outer of the inner. That was discussed quite a while ago. We also have this notion of the inner expressing itself in the outer, and this law that the outer is the expression of the inner. Here, Hegel is going to say what we need to attend to at this point, not that this stuff is unimportant, but what we really need to pay attention to now is how something similar to what goes on with the inner occurs with the outer, so that the outer itself has an inner and an outer. You might call it the outermost outer, right? And what we're translating here in Miller as antithesis could be translated as opposition. The Gegensatz between them, how are these distinguished from each other? How do these relate to each other? How are these connected with each other? And also, how do they connect back to this stuff as well? So he says, just as first the inner of the whole in relation to its own outer was considered, we're now going to consider the outer in terms of these two sides of it, or you might say it's inside and it's outside. The outer, considered by itself, is the structured shape in general, the system of life articulating itself in the element of being, and at the same time essentially the being for an other of the organism, objective being in its being for self. This other appears in the first instance as its outer inorganic nature. If these two are considered in relation to a law, the inorganic nature cannot, as we saw above, constitute the aspect of a law over against the organism, because the latter is at the same time absolutely for itself and has a universal and free relation to inorganic nature. Following up immediately on the previous paragraph, paragraph 284 is going to turn to considering the outer of organic beings, the organism, considered by itself, für sich betrachtet in the German. And what Hegel is going to say here should remind us of some of the earlier movements that were occurring, that he's referring back to in the 250s, specifically in paragraph 255, much earlier in this section, right? So he's going to tell us several things about what we find out when we consider the outer of the organic nature on its own account. One is that we're talking about structured shape in general. So consider the human body. There's as Hegel calls it, a Gestaltung überhaupt. You can identify me as having this particular Gestaltung that hopefully is the same as what you have to work with, unless these signals from YouTube somehow end up, being understood by some other kind of animal other than human beings, in which case I suppose things get much more interesting. Speculations like that aside, what we have is a structured shape in general, the outer of the being. We also have, as Hegel says, and here what we see is the inner sort of expressing itself through the outer. You don't have the outer totally without the inner. he calls it a system of life articulating itself in the element of being. And what does the element of being mean? Well, it's articulating itself in this, in reality. It has to take on determinacy, in fact, much determinacy. But life, as we've seen, is not itself indeterminate, but rather a flux, something that has a freedom inherent in it. Not a freedom of choice, but a deeper kind of freedom, which allows it to have a dynamism that allows it to, in certain respects, transcend any one particular configuration. So when we talk about a system of life, what we're talking about here is a system whose parts and whose orientations and organizations are changing over time, but it still remains an organic system. Then the third thing that he tells us, this is where we get to the very interesting part, is that the outer, the external, is the being for another of the organism. That is, the organism, we can talk about its dynamism, its inner, these three interesting functions, although Hegel says we can have many more: reproduction, irritability, sensibility, all of that great stuff, right? It has to have a locus in the world. And the outer is where we connect up with the world. This is, similar to the mind-body problem that bedeviled people so much in early modern philosophy. But what was really interesting about the mind-body problem was not just splitting things into dualities and all that, or can we reduce it all to one thing? It's thinking about how does something that clearly is different than its external environment, something that appears to be perhaps even a different kind of substance, how does that intersect with, not reduce to, but intersect with and interact with this whole world out here? There's different options. You can enfold it all into the mind and say everything's mind. That's the idealist path. The materialist path is to rather implausibly suggest, well, we can just reduce everything to matter, and we don't quite know how to do that. All that's very, very interesting, but we want to put that aside because what we're concentrating on here has to do with the fact that every single organism, insofar as it's an organism, not even necessarily conscious, this is not just about consciousness, but about life. Insofar as it is living, it becomes something that has an interiority that is different from the rest of the world, except insofar as there are other interiorities out there, right? Hegel's not going to go there quite yet in this paragraph. So the outer is the being for another, being for something else of an organism which itself is, as he says, something that is for itself. He calls it, here we go, objective being in its being for self, right? So what is that other? Well, there's lots of possibilities for that, but here Hegel reverts to talking about inorganic nature. He says the other at first, there's going to be plenty of others coming along, right, is outer inorganic nature. This is what we encountered earlier on, like I said, in the 250s. He says this other, if the two are considered in relation to a law, right, if we're trying to provide laws, what's the tendency? He says the inorganic nature cannot, as we saw above, constitute the aspect of a law over against the organism. So what is he talking about there? Well, you try to take this, which is more observable, the outer organic nature, and say, well, cold climates produce fur, right? We saw this as an example. Or, other things produce other things. Environment produces the externality, the outer of the organism, and thereby produces the organism as what it is. Hegel says, no, it doesn't really work like that. We've already seen some of the problems with that, and Hegel brings up this issue of freedom again. We're not talking anything like political freedom or even the freedom that people like to talk about of being able to like see two different options and choose them. We're talking about something even more basic here. The fact that life will find some sort of, slippery dodge to move out from the determinism that outer organic nature, which does operate according to some sort of determinism, wants to apply to it. That is part of what it means to be life. Sometimes life will be determined by its environment, but that's not because the environment itself has an absolute determinative capacity that just crushes the organism under it and makes it part of that system. No, rather it has to do with the organism being receptive to that sort of thing. So he goes on and he says the latter, the organism, is at the same time absolutely for itself, right? To be for itself means to have some degree of freedom. He says it has a universal and free relation to inorganic nature, which means that really we have to look at things this way rather than attempting to simply derive laws this way. And that's going to be a bit more difficult, but it requires us now to turn our attention to this side.